I came home early that afternoon because something didn't feel right, though I couldn't have told you why at the time, only that quiet, persistent tug in my chest that had been growing stronger with each passing day. The kind you learn not to ignore when you've lived long enough to recognize that instinct rarely lies. And as I pulled into the driveway 20 minutes ahead of schedule, I noticed Rebecca's car was already there, parked a little crooked like she'd rushed, which was unusual for her. Because Rebecca never rushed, she controlled everything down to the smallest detail, even how she placed her purse on the kitchen counter. Always perfectly aligned with the edge, always deliberate, and I remember sitting in my car for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the front door of the house I had lived in for over 35 years, the same door I had painted twice with Daniel when he was still a teenager, laughing as we got more paint on ourselves than on the wood, and I told myself I was being silly, that coming home early didn't mean anything, that families lived together, moved around each other, had conversations I didn't always need to be part of. But when I stepped out of the car and closed the door quietly, I realized I didn't want them to hear me yet, and I couldn't explain that either, only that something inside me had already shifted, already braced itself for something I hadn't even heard yet. And as I walked up the front steps, I noticed the house was unusually still, no television, no music, just the faint murmur of voices coming from the living room, low and careful, the kind of voices people use when they don't want to be overheard. And I paused with my hand on the doorknob, my heart beating just a little faster, not from fear, but from a strange clarity, like everything in my life had been leading quietly to this moment. And when I opened the door just enough to step inside without making a sound, I heard Rebecca's voice first, soft but sharp around the edges, saying, "She won't even realize what we've already moved." And I froze, my hand still resting against the door as it clicked softly behind me, and for a second I thought I must have misunderstood, that I had walked into the middle of some unrelated conversation, something about work or finances that had nothing to do with me. But then Daniel spoke, my son, my boy, the same voice that used to call me in the middle of the night when he couldn't sleep, now lower, hesitant but not surprised, not questioning, just agreeing. "And you're sure she can't access the account anymore?" And there was a pause, a small one, but long enough for something inside me to break in a quiet, almost polite way, like a glass set down too hard on a wooden table. And Rebecca let out a soft breath, almost a laugh. "Daniel, trust me, by the time she notices anything, it'll already be done." And I didn't move, I didn't breathe, I didn't step forward to announce myself or ask what they were talking about, because in that moment I understood something far more important than the details of their conversation. I understood that whatever they were doing, whatever they had already done, it wasn't new, it wasn't sudden, it wasn't a mistake, it was a plan, something carefully built over time, right in front of me while I was setting dinner tables and folding laundry and telling myself that the distance between us was just part of life, just part of growing older. And I stayed there in the entryway, hidden in the quiet shadow between the hallway and the living room, listening as the two people I trusted most spoke about me, like I wasn't even there anymore, like I had already become something distant, something manageable, something to be handled. And the strangest part wasn't the words themselves, it was how calm I felt as I listened, how steady my hands were at my sides, because somewhere deep inside, past the hurt and past the disbelief, there was a new kind of awareness settling in, cold and clear. And for the first time in a very long time, I realized I had been looking at my family all wrong, and whatever came next, I wouldn't make that mistake again. I stayed there for a few seconds longer, long enough for their voices to blur into a low hum that no longer carried meaning, and then I turned the handle just a little more firmly and stepped fully into the house, letting my footsteps sound exactly the way they always had, measured and familiar, the quiet rhythm of someone who belonged there. And almost immediately the conversation in the living room stopped, not abruptly, but in that careful, controlled way people use when they are trying to make a pause seem natural, and Rebecca appeared first, her smile already in place before she even saw my face, as if she had been wearing it the entire time. "Margaret, you are home early," she said, her voice smooth, warm, in a way that used to comfort me, and Daniel followed a second later, his expression just a fraction too neutral, like he had not quite decided which version of himself he needed to be yet. "Mom, everything okay?" he asked, and I looked at him, really looked at him, noticing things I had not allowed myself to see before, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flickered toward Rebecca for a split second before returning to me, and I smiled, the same gentle smile I had practiced for years, the one that reassured everyone that everything was fine, even when it was not. "I finished my appointment earlier than expected," I said calmly, setting my purse down on the entry table with deliberate care. "I thought I would come home and start dinner." and Rebecca stepped aside just enough to give me a clear path into the kitchen, her movements graceful, practiced, always just right. "That sounds lovely," she said, and I could feel her watching me as I walked past, measuring, assessing, but I did not turn around. I did not ask a single question. I did not let my voice betray what I had heard only moments before, because something inside me had already made a decision, a quiet one but absolute. I would not confront them, not yet, not without understanding everything first, and as I stood at the kitchen counter, rinsing my hands under warm water, I let the ordinary routine settle over me like a familiar coat, the scent of dish soap, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock on the wall that Daniel had given me for my birthday 10 years ago, all of it exactly the same as it had always been, and yet nothing felt the same anymore because now every detail seemed to carry a second meaning, a hidden layer I had never noticed before, and I began to see how carefully my life had been shifting around me, how subtly the center of everything had moved without me realizing it. I thought about the bank statements I had barely glanced at over the past year, trusting that everything was in order because it always had been. I thought about the way Rebecca had gradually taken over certain responsibilities, offering to help, to simplify things for me, to make my life easier, and how grateful I had been, how relieved I had felt to have someone so capable, so attentive. And I thought about Daniel, my son, who had once asked me for advice on every decision, who had once called just to hear my voice, and how those calls had become less frequent, shorter, more distracted, until eventually I was the one waiting for him, telling myself he was busy, that this was what happened when children grew up and built their own lives. And I reached for a towel and dried my hands slowly, carefully, as if each movement needed to be considered, because now I understood that what I had dismissed as distance, as change, as the natural passage of time, might have been something else entirely, something intentional, something planned. And from the living room I could hear their voices again, lighter now, casual, as if nothing important had been said at all, as if the world had not shifted in a single sentence, and I turned slightly, just enough to see their reflections. In the glass of the kitchen cabinet, Rebecca sitting upright, composed, her posture perfect, Daniel leaning forward slightly, listening to her, always listening to her, and I felt that same calm settle deeper into my chest, not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind that comes from clarity, from finally seeing what had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. And I picked up a knife and began slicing vegetables for dinner, each cut precise, even steady, because whatever they believed, whatever they thought they had already taken or would soon take, they were wrong about one thing. I was still here, I was still watching, and for the first time I was paying attention. Dinner that night unfolded the way it always had, with the same plates, the same soft lighting above the table, the same quiet clink of silverware against porcelain, and if someone had walked in from the outside, they would have seen nothing unusual at all, just a mother, her son, and his wife sharing a meal in a well-kept home. But I could feel the difference in every second that passed, in every glance that lingered just a moment too long or not long enough, and I took my seat at the head of the table as I always did, folding my hands briefly in my lap before reaching for my napkin, giving myself that small pause to observe, to listen, to notice what I had missed for so long. Rebecca complimented the meal, her tone warm and appreciative, exactly the way she had done countless times before, but now I heard something underneath it, a careful precision, as if each word had been chosen not to express gratitude, but to maintain an image. "This is wonderful, Margaret. You always know how to make everything feel so perfect," she said, and Daniel nodded, adding a quick agreement, his voice softer, almost automatic, and I looked at him again, noticing how he avoided meeting my eyes for more than a second, how his attention drifted back to Rebecca as if drawn there, anchored there, and I wondered how long that had been happening without me seeing it clearly, how many small moments had passed that I had dismissed as nothing, as normal, as part of life, and I smiled in return, thanking her, keeping my voice steady because I understood now that this dinner was not just a meal, it was a performance, and I needed to play my part just as carefully as they were playing theirs. We talked about ordinary things at first, the weather, a neighbor down the street who had recently moved, a sale at the grocery store, the kind of conversation that fills space without saying anything at all, and I let it continue, letting the silence between meaningful topics stretch just enough to invite something more, something real. And eventually Rebecca took the opening, as I knew she would. She set her fork down lightly and looked at me with that same composed expression. "Margaret, I was thinking," she began, and there it was, that familiar phrase, the one that always preceded a suggestion that somehow benefited her more than anyone else. "Maybe it is time we start simplifying things around the house, making everything a little easier for you." And I nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue because I wanted to hear exactly how she would say it, how she would frame it. You have done so much for so long, and we just want to make sure everything is organized properly, for the future. She added, her voice gentle, almost concerned, and Daniel shifted in his seat, clearing his throat softly. It just makes sense, Mom, to have everything in one place, easier to manage, he said, and I felt that same calm settle over me again, not because their words were comforting, but because they confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This was not spontaneous, this was not new, this was a continuation, a carefully constructed path they had been guiding me down for some time, and I picked up my glass of water, taking a slow sip before setting it back down, giving myself another moment to think, to choose my response with intention. That sounds very thoughtful, I said finally, my tone warm, appreciative, exactly what they expected to hear. And I saw the smallest flicker of relief pass between them, quick, subtle but unmistakable, as if they had been waiting for resistance that never came. And Rebecca smiled again, brighter this time, more confident. We can go over everything this weekend just to make sure all the accounts and documents are updated and secure, she said, and I nodded once more, as if the idea had just occurred to me as well, as if I had not already begun to question every detail of what they were suggesting. And the conversation moved on after that, back to safe, empty topics, but the shift had already happened, the direction had been set, and I continued to eat my dinner slowly, methodically, tasting each bite without really noticing the flavor because my mind was elsewhere, retracing the past months, the past years, fitting pieces together that had never quite made sense before. And by the time the plates were cleared and the dishes were done, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: whatever they believed about me, whatever role they thought I was playing in this situation, they were wrong. Because I was no longer simply living in this house, I was watching it, studying it, and for the first time I was beginning to understand the game they thought I did not even know existed. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of calm that used to comfort me, sunlight slipping through the kitchen window in soft, familiar lines, warming the same countertops I had wiped down thousands of times before, and I moved through my routine exactly as I always had, brewing coffee, setting out a single mug, opening the small drawer where I kept my reading glasses. But this time every action felt deliberate, measured, as if I were walking through a place I knew well but no longer trusted. And I sat down at the table with my coffee, wrapping my hands around the warmth as I stared at the stack of mail I had brought in the night before. Something I would normally sort without much thought: bills, advertisements, the occasional handwritten card. But today I looked at each envelope more carefully, noting the return addresses, the weight of the paper, the subtle differences I had once overlooked. And I realized how long it had been since I had truly paid attention to any of it, how easily I had allowed certain responsibilities to shift away from me, not because I could not handle them, but because someone else had offered to, kindly, patiently, insistently. And I opened the first envelope slowly, reading every line, every number, every detail, letting the information settle instead of rushing past it. And then the second and the third, until patterns began to emerge, small at first, almost unnoticeable: a payment redirected here, a notification sent there, changes that individually might have meant nothing, but together form something else entirely, something intentional. And I felt that same quiet clarity from the day before return, stronger now, more defined, because this was no longer just a conversation I had overheard. This was evidence, subtle but real, and I stood up from the table and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one Daniel had helped me assemble years ago, where I kept my files organized in labeled folders, or at least they used to be organized. And I pulled open the drawer and paused for a moment, noticing how some of the folders were no longer where I remembered placing them, how others had been added, their labels written in a handwriting that was not mine, neat, controlled, unmistakably Rebecca's. And I slid one folder out carefully, opening it on the desk and flipping through the documents inside, my eyes moving slowly across each page, checking dates, signatures, account numbers. And there it was again, that pattern, that quiet shift of control from one place to another. Everything explained just enough to seem reasonable, to appear helpful, but structured in a way that gradually moved decisions out of my hands. And I closed the folder gently, setting it back exactly where I had found it, making sure nothing looked disturbed, because I understood now that this was not something I could confront with questions or emotion. Not yet. This required patience, the same kind of patience I had used my entire life to build this home, to raise my son, to create stability where there had once been uncertainty. And I returned to the kitchen just as I heard footsteps coming down the hallway. Daniel first, his movements familiar, followed by Rebecca, her presence announced not by sound, but by the shift in the air, that same composed energy she carried with her everywhere. "Good morning," she said lightly, as if nothing had changed, as if the world was exactly as it had been yesterday, and I smiled, lifting my mug slightly in greeting. "Good morning," I replied, my voice calm, steady, the same as always, because they were still playing their roles and so was I, but now I knew the difference. Now I understood that what looked like care, like organization, like thoughtful planning, might actually be something else entirely. And as Rebecca moved toward the counter, reaching for a glass, I watched her reflection in the window above the sink, noticing how confident she seemed, how certain, as if everything was already decided, already secured. And I felt no anger, no urgency, only that same steady awareness growing stronger with each passing moment, because for the first time I was not reacting, I was observing, and that changed everything. Later that afternoon, when the house settled into its usual quiet rhythm and Daniel had left for work, I found myself standing in the hallway longer than necessary, listening to the faint sound of Rebecca moving somewhere upstairs, her footsteps light, controlled, always measured, and I realized how different that sound felt to me now, how it no longer blended into the background of daily life but instead stood out, deliberate and purposeful, like everything else she did, and I turned slowly and walked back toward the living room, my eyes drifting to the small desk again, to the drawer I had opened earlier, because once you begin to notice something, truly notice it, you cannot simply stop, you cannot return to the comfort of not knowing, and I sat down carefully, pulling the drawer open just enough to slide out another folder, this one thinner, less organized, as if it had been accessed more recently, and I opened it with steady hands, reminding myself to breathe evenly, to remain calm, because whatever I found here would not change the fact that I needed to stay in control. And as I flipped through the papers, I saw documents I did not remember signing, authorizations written in language that felt familiar but distant, like something I might have glanced at quickly without fully understanding, trusting that it was routine, that it was necessary, and I felt a quiet realization settle into place, not sharp or sudden, but heavy, like something that had been forming for a long time. I had not been careless, I had been trusting, and there is a difference, one that is easy to overlook until it is too late. And I paused on a page that listed account access permissions, my name still there, but no longer alone, Rebecca's name appearing beside it, followed by a date I recognized as one of those afternoons when she had offered to help me organize things. Her voice gentle, reassuring, her presence calm and confident as she guided me through forms I had not questioned. And I closed my eyes for just a second, not in regret but in acknowledgement, because regret would not serve me now, only clarity would. And when I opened them again, I continued reading, tracing the changes, the small adjustments that together shifted control piece by piece, and I realized that nothing had been taken all at once, nothing had been forced or obvious, everything had been given slowly, willingly, under the careful suggestion that it was for my benefit, for my convenience, for my peace of mind. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was precise, calculated, and strangely patient. And I understood then that Rebecca had not simply stepped into my life, she had studied it, learned its patterns, its weaknesses, its rhythms, and adapted herself accordingly, becoming exactly what I needed until I no longer realized I needed anything else. And I set the folder back into place, making sure every edge aligned perfectly, every paper exactly as I had found it, because the last thing I wanted was to alert them, to disrupt whatever timeline they believed they were following. And I stood up slowly, smoothing my hands over the front of my sweater as I turned toward the staircase, because there was something else I needed to confirm, something I could not ignore now that I had seen enough to understand the direction this was going. And I climbed the stairs with the same steady pace I had always used, each step familiar beneath my feet, leading me to the hallway where the bedrooms were, where my door remained slightly open, just as I had left it that morning, and I paused there, listening again, but this time not for voices, not for words, but for absence, for the subtle difference between what should be and what was, and I stepped inside, my gaze moving slowly across the room, taking in every detail, the dresser, the nightstand, the small jewelry box I had kept in the same place for years, and I walked toward it, opening it, gently, my fingers brushing against the items inside, counting without counting, noticing without reacting, because something felt different, not missing in an obvious way, but altered, disturbed, as if it had been touched, moved, returned. And I closed the box carefully, placing it back exactly where it belonged, because this was no longer about one conversation or one document. This was a pattern, a system, something that extended into every part of my life. And as I stood there in the quiet of my own room, I felt that same calm settle over me once again, deeper now, more certain, because the truth was no longer something I had to search for. It was something I was beginning to see clearly, piece by piece, and whatever they believed about me, whatever assumptions they had made about what I would notice or when I would notice it, they had underestimated one very important thing. I was still paying attention, and now I was ready to see everything. That night I did not sleep the way I usually did, not because I was restless, but because my mind had begun to arrange things differently, quietly placing memories side by side in a way they had never been before. And as I lay there in the dim light of my bedroom, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling, I found myself revisiting moments that once felt ordinary, harmless, even kind, and seeing them now through a sharper lens. I remembered the first time Rebecca had suggested helping me with my finances, how she had sat beside me at the kitchen table, her voice soft, patient, explaining how much easier things could be if everything was consolidated, if access was shared, if responsibilities were divided, and I had felt grateful then, relieved to have someone younger, more current with the way things worked, someone who seemed genuinely interested in making my life simpler, and I had not questioned it, not really, because why would I question help offered so gently, so thoughtfully? And then there were the smaller things, the subtle shifts that had seemed insignificant at the time, Daniel asking fewer questions, making more decisions on his own, Rebecca stepping in to answer on his behalf, always smoothly, always with that same composed confidence, and I had told myself it was normal, that this was what marriage looked like, that he was building his own life and I needed to step back to give them space. But now I could see the pattern more clearly, how each step had led to the next, how each small adjustment had made the next one easier, until eventually the balance had shifted completely without me ever feeling the moment it happened, and I turned my head slightly, looking toward the doorway, remembering how many times I had walked through this house without truly seeing it, without noticing how certain spaces had changed, how certain items had moved, how decisions had been made without my input, and I realized that what I had thought was time passing was actually something else entirely, something deliberate, something guided, and I sat up slowly, reaching for the lamp beside my bed and turning it on, letting the soft light fill the room, because I no longer wanted to lie there and think. I needed to act, not in a way that would alert them, not in a way that would disrupt what they believed was still unfolding quietly, but in a way that would allow me to understand everything fully, completely, without assumption or doubt. And I stood up, walking to the small closet where I kept a few personal items, things I had not needed to access in years, and I pulled out a box from the back, setting it carefully on the bed before opening it. Inside were older documents, copies of original agreements, records that had not been touched, not updated, not adjusted, and I began to go through them slowly, comparing what I remembered with what I had seen earlier that day, noting the differences, the changes, the way control had shifted from one name to another, from one signature to the next, and I felt no panic, no urgency, only a growing sense of certainty, because the more I looked, the more consistent everything became, and consistency meant intention, and intention meant planning, and planning meant this was not something that could be undone with a simple conversation or a confrontation. This required something else, something quieter, something just as deliberate. And I closed the box after a while, placing it back exactly where it had been, because I understood now that my role had changed. I was no longer simply living within this situation, I was moving through it with purpose, and as I turned off the light and returned to bed, I felt a different kind of calm settle over me, not the kind that comes from comfort, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand. And for the first time since that moment in the doorway, since those words I had heard without them knowing I was there, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth fully, not as something that might be happening, not as something I still needed to confirm, but as something real, something already in motion. And as I closed my eyes, I understood that whatever came next would not be decided by them alone, because I was no longer the person they thought I was, and I was no longer watching without understanding. I was watching with intention, and that made all the difference. The next few days unfolded with a strange sense of normalcy, the kind that only exists when something beneath the surface has already shifted but no one has acknowledged it yet. And I moved through each morning and evening with the same quiet consistency I had always maintained, preparing meals, tidying the house, responding when spoken to, smiling when expected. But now there was something else layered beneath those actions, something deliberate, something observant, and I began to notice not just what was happening, but when it was happening, the timing of conversations, the moments Rebecca chose to bring up certain topics, the way Daniel deferred to her more often than he realized, and I paid attention to patterns because patterns reveal intention in a way that words never fully do. And it did not take long before I saw how carefully everything had been structured. Discussions about finances always happened when I was distracted. Decisions were introduced as suggestions rather than statements, changes were framed as improvements rather than shifts in control, and I almost admired the precision of it, the patience, the way nothing felt forced, nothing felt urgent, everything simply appeared as the natural next step. And I understood now why it had worked so well, why I had never felt the need to question it, because it had never felt like something was being taken, it had always felt like something was being given, and that distinction is easy to miss until you step back far enough to see the full picture. And one afternoon, while Rebecca was out and Daniel was still at work, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad in front of me, something I had not done in years, and I began to write, not out of panic, not out of confusion, but out of clarity, listing what I knew, what I had seen, what I had confirmed, separating assumption from fact, memory from evidence. And as the page began to fill, I felt that same steady calm guiding me, because each line I wrote made the situation less overwhelming, less abstract, more defined, and definition is something you can work with, something you can respond to. And I realized that for the first time since this had begun, I was no longer reacting to what they were doing, I was understanding it, and that gave me something they did not expect me to have: time, because they believed they were ahead, they believed they were moving toward an outcome I did not see coming, but in reality, they were following a path I had already begun to map out. And I closed the notepad after a while, placing it carefully in a drawer where it would not be easily found, not hidden, but not obvious either, because I was not trying to conceal what I was doing, I was simply choosing when it would be seen. And later that evening, as we sat together again in the living room, the television playing softly in the background, I watched them without appearing to, noting how comfortable they seemed, how certain, how at ease in a situation they believed was still entirely under their control. And Rebecca leaned slightly toward Daniel, speaking quietly, her tone low enough that it might have gone unnoticed before, but now I heard it clearly, every word, every inflection. "We should finalize everything this weekend," she said, and Daniel nodded, his agreement immediate, unquestioning, and I felt that same quiet understanding settle even deeper, because this was no longer something unfolding slowly over time. This was approaching a point of completion, a moment where everything they had been building toward would come together. And I smiled softly to myself, not out of satisfaction, not out of victory, but out of recognition, because timing matters and they had chosen theirs carefully, but so had I. And as I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, I realized that the difference between us was no longer awareness. We both understood what was happening now. The difference was perspective. They believed they were reaching the end of something, while I understood that we were only just beginning. And for the first time since all of this had started, I felt completely certain of one thing: whatever happened next would not unfold the way they expected, because I was no longer simply observing their plan, I was preparing my own. By the time the weekend approached, everything around me felt sharper, clearer, as if the entire house had shifted into focus in a way it never had before. And I moved through each day with quiet precision, not rushing, not hesitating, simply aligning my actions with a decision I had already made. And on Saturday morning, I woke earlier than usual, the sky still pale with that soft gray light that comes just before sunrise, and I dressed carefully, choosing something simple, understated, the kind of outfit that would not draw attention, because today was not about appearance, it was about timing. And as I stepped into the hallway, I paused briefly, listening, hearing nothing but the steady silence of a house still asleep, and I walked downstairs without making a sound, my hand brushing lightly against the railing as I moved, grounding myself in the familiar. And in the kitchen I prepared my coffee the same way I always did, measuring, pouring, waiting, allowing the routine to settle my thoughts into place. And once the mug was warm in my hands, I sat at the table and looked around the room, taking in every detail, every object that had remained constant even as everything else had changed. And I allowed myself one final moment of stillness before the day began, because I understood that once it did, things would not remain as they were, not for them, not for me. And I finished my coffee slowly before standing, rinsing the mug, placing it back exactly where it belonged, and then I moved to the small desk once more, opening the drawer with the same calm deliberation I had practiced all week, retrieving the documents I had reviewed, confirming once again what I already knew, not because I doubted it, but because certainty requires repetition. And I closed the drawer gently, leaving everything exactly as it had been, because nothing I did today needed to be visible yet, not until the right moment. And later that morning, Rebecca appeared in the kitchen, her presence as composed as ever, her movements smooth, controlled. "Good morning, Margaret," she said, her tone light, and I returned the greeting with the same warmth I had always shown, because there was no reason to change that now. not when consistency was exactly what she expected from me, and Daniel joined us shortly after, and the three of us moved through the morning with an ease that would have seemed genuine to anyone watching, but beneath it, I could feel the quiet anticipation building, not just in me, but in them as well, because they believed today was important. They believed today was the step that would finalize everything they had been working toward. And I watched as Rebecca gathered a small stack of papers, placing them neatly on the table, aligning the edges with careful precision, her confidence visible in every movement, and Daniel sat beside her, his posture attentive, ready, and I took my place across from them, folding my hands lightly in front of me, my expression calm, open exactly as they expected, and Rebecca began to speak, her voice steady, reassuring, explaining the documents in a way that sounded helpful, organized, thoughtful, but now I heard the structure beneath it, the way each explanation guided toward a specific outcome, the way each detail was framed to encourage agreement rather than understanding, and I listened without interrupting, without questioning, allowing her to move through everything she had prepared. Because this was not the moment to challenge her, this was the moment to observe fully, to let them believe that everything was proceeding exactly as they had planned. And when she finally placed the pen in front of me, her smile soft, encouraging, I looked down at the papers, letting my eyes move slowly across the lines, not because I needed to read them again, but because I wanted them to see me reading, to see me taking my time, and I lifted the pen, holding it lightly between my fingers, pausing just long enough to let the silence settle. And in that silence I felt something shift, not in the room but within myself, a quiet confirmation that everything had aligned exactly as it needed to. And I set the pen back down, gently looking up at them with the same calm expression I had worn all week, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty pass between them, small, almost imperceptible, but enough because they had expected movement, they had expected completion, and instead they were met with stillness, and I realized then that this was where everything changed. Not with a dramatic gesture, not with raised voices or sudden confrontation, but with a single moment of pause, a refusal to move forward. On their timeline, and as I sat there, hands resting lightly on the table, I understood that whatever they had planned for today, whatever outcome they believed was already secured, it was no longer theirs to control. The silence stretched longer than either of them expected, and I could see it in the way Rebecca's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the edge of the table, in the way Daniel shifted in his seat as if trying to find solid ground where there was none, and I let that silence settle, not as a tactic, not as a performance, but as a reflection of something they had not accounted for, the possibility that I was no longer moving at their pace. And after a moment, Rebecca leaned forward just a fraction, her voice still gentle but now carrying a thin edge of urgency. "Is everything all right, Margaret?" she asked, and I looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the composed exterior she had so carefully maintained, but the calculation behind it, the expectation, the quiet certainty that had guided her every step until now, and I offered a small, calm smile, the same one I had worn so many times before. But this time it belonged to me, not to the role I had been playing. "Everything is perfectly all right," I said, my voice steady, measured, leaving no room for misunderstanding, and I reached toward the stack of papers, not to sign them, but to gently gather them together, aligning the edges just as she had done earlier, mirroring her precision, her control, and I slid them back across the table toward her, not abruptly, not forcefully, just enough to make it clear that they were no longer in my hands. And I saw it then, that flicker again, stronger. This time, the moment where expectation begins to fracture, where certainty gives way to doubt, and Daniel spoke next, his voice uncertain, searching. "Mom, we just thought this would make things easier for you," he said, and I nodded slowly, acknowledging his words without accepting them, because I understood now that what he believed and what was true were no longer the same thing. "I am sure you did," I replied, my tone calm, almost kind, and I let that sit between us for a moment before continuing. "And I appreciate how much thought you both have put into everything," and Rebecca's expression softened slightly at that, her confidence beginning to return, as if she believed the moment had simply been a hesitation, a pause before agreement. But I was not finished, not yet, and I folded my hands lightly on the table, leaning back just enough to create space between us, not physical distance but something quieter, something more definitive. "But I have also been doing some thinking of my own," I added, and that was when the room changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone outside of it, but in the subtle shift of attention, the way both of them focused on me now, fully, completely, because this was not part of the plan they had prepared for. This was not a response they had anticipated, and I continued, my voice even unhurried. I have reviewed my accounts, my documents, my arrangements, and I have decided to make a few changes. And I saw Daniel's brow tighten slightly, confusion replacing his earlier uncertainty, while Rebecca remained very still, her composure intact but more rigid now, more deliberate. What kind of changes? She asked. Carefully, and I met her gaze without hesitation, without discomfort, because there was nothing left to hide, not from myself, not from them. The kind that ensure everything remains exactly where it belongs, I said, and I let the meaning settle without elaboration, because I did not need to explain every detail, I did not need to justify my decisions, and for a moment no one spoke, the weight of what I had said filling the space between us. And I could see it clearly now, the realization, beginning to form, slow but undeniable, that whatever path they had been following, it no longer led where they thought it did. And I stood up then, not abruptly, not with any sense of finality, just a simple natural movement, as if the conversation had reached its conclusion, and I smoothed my hands over the front of my sweater, the same small gesture I had made so many times before, but this time it felt different, more certain, more complete. We can revisit this another time, I said. Quietly, my tone calm, leaving no room for argument, and I turned toward the kitchen, not looking back, not waiting for a response because I did not need one, and as I walked away, I felt that same steady calm settle over me once more, deeper than before, not because everything had been resolved, but because something far more important had shifted, the balance had changed, and for the first time in a long time, I was no longer being guided. I was choosing my own direction, and whatever came next, whatever decisions needed to be made, they would be made by me, not in reaction, not in fear, but with the same quiet certainty I had carried through every step of my life. And as I reached the kitchen doorway, I paused for just a moment, not to listen, not to check if they were speaking behind me, but simply to acknowledge what I already knew. They had believed I would not see, they had believed I would not understand, and most of all, they had believed I would not change, and that was their first mistake.